Hello and welcome back to Hijrah Talk. I'm your host, Timothy Caldis. Joining us today is Dr. Azfar Khan. He's currently a freelance consultant, but previously he worked for over 20 years with the International Labor Organization. And among his many roles within that organization, he served as a senior migration specialist focusing on Arab states. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
It's great to have you.
Pleasure's all mine, yeah.
So today we want to talk about the economics of migration and the impact and role that migration plays in the global economy and in the economies of countries that are both hosting migrants as well as the countries from which they come.
Right.
A lot of the discussion on migration when it comes to the economy in the press and in government circles seems to be negative. There's a lot of concern that migrants impose some sort of burden on local economies in host countries. Do you think that the research on the impact of migration on those host economies shares that or reflects that?
You know, the issue can get quite emotionally charged.
Absolutely.
When you're sort of discussing migration. At a general level, I think migration is welcomed in most of these countries. Yes, but of course there are these populist politicians who bring up this issue of how it is taking away the jobs, it is taking away, dampening the wages for workers. But when you look at the economic or the evidence, I mean, there is absolutely no evidence to prove that. Actually, the evidence says otherwise, right? OECD produced a report last year in which they asked the basic question, is migration good for the economy? And the consensus was yes, that it was very good for the economy. Oxford Analysis produced a report, which I'll talk about later, but let me first focus on the work that was done in the Paris School of Economics by Hippolyte Dalby and his group. Now, what they did was they took data from 15 countries, and this data was for 30 years, from 15 Western European countries. Mm-hmm. And they came to the conclusion, they developed it into a kind of a mathematical model, and they came to the conclusion that there is absolutely no evidence to support that migrants or asylum seekers connote a financial burden on the economy. Actually, they said that if you don't have migration, the economy could be worse off.
So migration is actually essential to economic growth.
Migration is essentially fairly essential to the economic growth. In Britain, the Oxford Economics did some analysis of data, and they found that over their lifetime, the European migrants coming into Britain, for example, would contribute something close to about £78,000 over their lifetime, net contribution to the economy. That is after what they pay in taxes and what they receive in terms of the benefits. And on average, that's about £70,000 higher.
Than a native-born.
Yeah, I mean, than the native-born population. The non-European migrants would contribute something close to about £28,000. Okay, so per person, it doesn't make much, in a sense, the kind of a contribution, but they're still positive. Mm-hmm. And under this scenario, if you look at the UK citizens' net contribution to the coffers, you find that they're zero. Okay. Right? So if migrants coming in 2016, mm-hmm.
They
were to spend their lifetime, in total, the quantum of income generated would be something close to £29 billion.
It's quite substantial.
That's quite substantial, right? So it's positive. So the argument basically that they make demands on the social services, the fiscal impact shows otherwise.
Okay.
We're looking at what they pay in taxation. The fiscal impact is measured in what these migrants pay in taxation versus what they receive in terms of the social benefits.
Okay, so you're saying that all the economic data seems to show that they're actually net contributors to the economy.
Absolutely. Sorry, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Is there any evidence to suggest that when it comes to jobs that they are having an impact on people, native-born citizens' ability to keep or retain jobs?
Again, the evidence is to the contrary. This is again kind of a slogan or a myth that is perpetrated.
It's a really popular idea.
Yeah, very popular idea, yes. Look, to a certain extent, it depends upon whether migrant workers are substitutes or they complement the work that is done there. If they substitute, then obviously certain kind of a competition is created,
Right.
and in the short term, they may be able to get jobs at lower wages than what the workers are paid. But this impact has also been gauged, through different models, and many people have found it to be. I mean, certainly the Migration Observatory at the Oxford University and other places have found it to be statistically insignificant. Whereas if you're looking at the skilled workers, they actually complement the native workers over there. And in a sense, if you complement this kind of a work, then productivity as general increases. And because of that, there is a rise in wages for the workers in the economy.
So what we've seen is that there is a capacity to absorb migrants, and that there are jobs actually in a lot of these economies that they're going towards. But do you think that there's an adequate legal infrastructure for migration and for these migrant workers to facilitate their movement?
Well, those who come in through the legal channels, yes, of course. I mean, they're subject to the labor law, and they're protected under the labor law. The worry is more in terms of those who come in through irregular channels, because they are most vulnerable, and they can be exploited badly, and they're not entitled to any kind of the benefits, social, economic benefits that the country has to offer. And they're constantly also on the lookout of not being caught and things. It's a very unstable kind of a life for them. Migration is also quite stratified. I mean, the high-skilled workers and the better-skilled workers have always been welcomed in the countries, and they usually come in through the legal channels. But it's usually the lower-skilled workers. I mean, the ones who are just escaping poverty and want to come and improve their lives, and they do it with, in various ways. And usually they find themselves ending up in the informal economy, where there is absolutely no protection, right? In countries, many countries of the world, I mean, particularly in the Middle East and other places, you see that they are not well protected. I mean, even under the labor law. Right? The labor law that exists for their protection, they're not protected under the labor law. I've seen people work very long hours. There is a law in these countries, in some of these countries, that if the temperature goes above 40 degrees, they're not entitled to work. But officially, it never goes above 40 degrees, so it could be 48 out there in the shade, and you'd still see these people working. So the conditions are different. I mean, in various parts of the world. But in the developed economies, of course, the informal workers would suffer, and usually they are the ones who are then, the employers then basically call upon to do different kinds of work and are severely abused.
One thing that I had seen, though, is that among lower wage workers, there was some concern that the influx of lower skilled migrant workers could bring down those wages. Are there any examples of mitigating policies that can help prevent that sort of impact?
In the short run, the migrant workers may dampen the wages for the lower skills, right? However, there could be government protection through certain institutions if they were to sort of look at it in terms of fixing a kind of a living wage. And what does that living wage would constitute, or would depend upon the different governments how they want to design that. But there could be that nobody could go below that kind of a living wage. It's not the minimum wage; it's the living wage.
Right.
You see, which would allow, let's say, the workers and their families to live a life of dignity and decency.
No, I think so. Basically, if we had the right regulatory framework in place,
absolutely,
this particular challenge could be overcome.
Yeah.
On top of that, though, isn't it also exacerbating the impact on native workers when someone comes as an irregular migrant and is in the informal sector? They lack the protections of a minimum wage. They lack the protection of certain Social Security taxes being paid for them, and so as a result, they're competing in an illegal fashion in terms of their employer, not in terms of the employee now. And so if there was more of a legal infrastructure to guarantee that the economy actually could bring in all of the migrant workers that it needed or wanted, then would that not also better protect the local workforce as well?
Well, I'm not so sure to what extent irregular migration. I mean, I totally believe that I think you're right. Migration has to be better managed. Okay, I mean, there I will not disagree. But I'm not so sure how you can stem the flow of irregular workers coming into the countries. What motivates them to sort of take? I mean, they may not have the skills, and because they don't have the skills, they may not be accepted in a country through legal channels, right? So they try to come in and go into the informal economy, where they help in the accumulation. They help in increasing demands because of course, when they have to subsist. So the wages and the income that they get, they spend out there.
Right.
They're not the ones who really in competition with the low-wage workers, because the native low-wage workers are all covered, if they have a job. But the quantum of employment has also declined because of the economic crisis in the developed world, right? So when you get workers, let's say refugees, or when you had an open market, for example, the Europeans going to Britain and other places, there is an impact on, there is competition in the low skill, because these skills are easy to acquire and they're not very specialized.
Right.
And there is a competition, and there may be a dampening effect on wages. But as research, most of the research has shown that this is very small and statistically insignificant.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
But if it is the case that there is a demand for these lower skilled workers, these migrant workers, then should there not then be more legal mechanisms for their regular migration as well? You're saying that, I mean, currently most of...
You mean to sort of raise the
standards?
The standards, yes,
Right.
exactly. How can you, I mean, this is a good question, because I cannot give you an answer on, how do you protect workers in an informal economy, right? Who are under the radar, right? Who don't sort of conform, or are not under the protection of the labor law.
By definition, they're not being watched by the government.
They're not being watched by the government. How do you extend social protection to these people, right? So it becomes an issue. You have these Moroccan workers working in the south of Spain, picking oranges, right? Same is happening in Florida, and in many of these other places. So it's an issue. I mean, how are you going to go and protect these people?
Right, because it seems that most of the emphasis for these days is on bringing in skilled labor. And when it comes to migration policy and facilitating legal migration, that's always what you're hearing from governments, whether it be the blue card in Europe or even in the United States. They've tried to do away recently with the lottery system that was a bit more diverse in terms of the skill set that the migrants would come with. But it does still seem to be clear that there is a demand for those workers, and if there it might be helpful to develop visa systems and that would bring them in and have them there legally. The state benefits from them more clearly, as well as they would be paying taxes, and also they'd be able to guarantee their protections and prevent this admittedly small but still present issue of competition with the lower skilled workers who are already there, and make sure that they're competing on an even playing field, and perhaps at least give the government a mechanism for raising their standards collectively.
I suppose certain initiatives could be taken in this regard, on how governments could intervene to improve the social welfare of the irregular workforce. I mean, but it's happening everywhere. Take a look at the migrant streams moving in from Mexico and other Latin American countries into America. You go and see the tobacco farms in North Carolina, and you find that, most of the workers there are from Latin America. And There are funny situations, where these workers have children who are actually Americans,
Right.
but they themselves aren't.
Right.
So they're illegals. And how do you naturalize them if they stay for a long period of time?
There's a lot of that in the United States.
There are a lot of sectors over there, sexual activity that takes place, particularly in agriculture, which requires their presence.
Right.
We know about what happened in the Napa Valley and when there was a boom in the wine industry, and all these workers coming in and working over there from Latin America, from Mexico. So there's huge pressure for them to leave, and if they come in through irregular channels, immediately government says, well, they're illegal. Well, yes, and to a certain extent, we would like to call them that they're irregular, right? They came in through irregular channels. But the question, I have no answer, honestly, Tim. I mean, on how best you can protect them and what initiatives can be taken. But, just from the perspective of human rights, and that, you have to accept everybody, in a decent way, you have to respect their dignity. I think there's something can be done.
Lately, we've been seeing a lot of governments, particularly European governments, and to a lesser extent, the United States government, looking at using foreign aid as a tool to deter migration. They feel that if they can assist with the development of the countries of origin, that perhaps less people will seek to move to their countries. At the same time, though, people have suggested that the figure would have to be enormous for that to work out. Foreign aid currently is not really a dramatically large amount, and remittances, on the other hand, coming from migrant workers, has exceeded $600 billion a year now. And so, do you think that's a realistic policy tool, and especially in light of the economic power of the migrant workers themselves?
It is migration from the sending countries, I would basically say, is related to a development failure. Mm-hmm. And how can the foreign aid sort of stop that? I mean, you need huge amounts of investment and expenditure to be able to provide the kind of opportunities. I don't believe that people want to leave their country, just to go abroad and enjoy life over there. I mean, there are certain needs, the familial needs, the family needs, the community needs, that they want to sort of fulfill. Let me tell you what happened very recently. Prior to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, being endorsed in the General Assembly in 2017, right? They had a meeting on financing development in Addis Ababa, mm-hmm. a UN initiated meeting. And there, the consensus, or what came out of that meeting, was that yes, the developed countries would provide some foreign aid, but don't expect any more than what you're getting right now, mm-hmm. right? So if it is related to development, of course, then it has to be sort of buttressed by other sources. Let's say other bilateral agreements with countries, because that foreign aid in itself is not going to sort out this problem. It is a development problem that people are leaving. They're leaving simply because there are far less opportunities in the countries to make a livelihood, to strengthen their livelihood, or for the subsistence and sustenance and the development of their families. And they're leaving for that reason. To what extent is that problem going to be solved? Right? So I don't think that the idea that the foreign aid in itself is going to solve the problem. There were initiatives taken by the European Union, for example, in West Africa, where they said that if they built enough vocational institutions and they trained the people over there, then these people won't leave. Well, they had another thought coming, because there was more of an impetus to migration once the people acquired these skills, because they figured that they could go and work in the higher skilled sectors, the relatively higher skilled sectors. So.
And there's a shortage of vocationally trained people in a lot of these developed
countries.
So
absolutely.
There's actually a lot of demand for that type of labor.
That's right. Right. So in some ways, it can, to a certain extent, alleviate the problem. But I really don't think. I think that there needs to be a more cohesive and an expansive development strategy within a country, that can sort of sort out the problem over a long run. You're not going to do it overnight.
No, I think that it's important really to think about that gap in opportunity, and when there are so many more opportunities abroad, it seems almost inevitable that people would seek to maximize their opportunities and pursue them. Coming back to this issue of remittances, we've seen very sharp growth in remittances in the last decade. As I mentioned, it's now about to surpass $600 billion a year. And what we've also noticed is that remittances are catching up. They've exceeded foreign aid by a lot, but they're also even starting to catch up with foreign direct investment. And it's not far behind FDI right now. Also, we're seeing that it's a bit more stable than FDI. So, for example, after the financial crisis, we saw a sharp decline in FDI, whereas remittances basically had a very small speed bump and continued to grow and even accelerate. What kind of opportunity do remittances offer countries of origin in terms of their economies and economic development? And is it a stable source of capital that can be used also for development itself?
A good question, because the thing is that remittances themselves are differentiated by, let's say, income levels. Mm-hmm. You know, that the rich who send back money home, this money is essentially finding its way into real estate and other areas of the economy. It's not really going into any productive, I mean, that's the general appreciation of the situation, into any productive ventures. Then there are the poor element, who essentially sent money back home basically to help their families make ends meet. Okay, they are a powerful tool in terms of poverty alleviation, right? But how long can they be sustained, right? I'll give you an example of Pakistan, for example, where there was, in the early 80s, they constituted something close to about 50% of the merchandise exports of the country, right? A lot of money was coming in. But then suddenly there was a dip in immigration to the Middle East from Pakistan, because at that time there was some kind of a leveling. And what we found that many of these ventures that these people had started went under, mm-hmm. because most of these ventures are essentially dependent on the sources of funds which are exogenously determined. It's, you know, the exchange that takes place, how often do you spend, you know, it's just like in Europe, you know, when the migrants workers come in, they spend the money, they create a certain kind of a demand, and the production expands in the same way. But once these funds sort of dried up over there, you know, the economic activity sort of lessened.
So the local market couldn't take over?
Local market couldn't take over because there was no money. I mean, you know, you right. need some kind. So if you can sort of, let's say, look at the tenure of migration for a particular migrant. Okay, how long has he or she is going to be outside the country, you know, and to be able to send that money. And these funds are usually not invested, you mm-hmm. know, in any major way. Now, they can be drawn into some kind of fruitful investment, but those enabling conditions have to be created by the government. The government in Pakistan invited these people to put their money in bonds, mm-hmm. right? But the bonds had a nominal yield, okay, let's say 10%. But if the inflation was running at 12%, the real value was dropping. So what these people did was a very remarkable thing.
Thank you so much for that. That was really helpful for us to get a feel for the economics of migration and how that variable plays into this phenomenon of migration that we're looking at. Really a pleasure.
Thank you, Tim. The pleasure was all mine. And I think these are important issues which need a larger audience. And I'm really thankful that Hijrah Talks is taking the initiative to take it further.
I appreciate that, and I hope together we can reach that audience. Thank you so much for joining us on Hijrah Talk. I'm your host, Timothy Kaldis. Until next time, take care.